For 6 years, Eleanor Vance wrote to a soldier who never once wrote back. A letter every week, 312 letters, into silence. Everyone told her to stop, that he was dead, or worse, that he had simply forgotten her. She wrote anyway. And tonight, at a ball she was only permitted to attend as a poor relation, half hidden at the edge of a room full of people who barely knew her name, she looked up, and he was standing across the room. Alive. A duke now, not a soldier. Dressed in dark silk where there had once been a worn uniform, with a hardness in his face that 6 years and something terrible had carved there. And the moment their eyes met across that glittering crowd, Eleanor's heart stopped, because he knew her, instantly, completely. There was no searching in his expression, no struggle to place a face from long ago. He knew exactly who she was. So, why, for 6 years, through 312 unanswered letters, had he let her believe he never read a single word? Stay with me. Because the answer is not what you think. It was never that he forgot her. It was that remembering her out loud would have gotten her killed. Let me take you back. To understand tonight, you have to understand the 6 years that came before it. Eleanor Vance was the kind of person the world is built to overlook. Her parents had died when she was 16, leaving her with a good name, a gentle heart, and almost nothing else. And so she had been taken in, that polite phrase that hides so much, by her wealthy cousins, the Cavendishes of Brookhaven. She was not a daughter there, she was not quite a servant either. She lived in the cold space between a poor relation, expected to be endlessly grateful, endlessly useful, and endlessly invisible. She mended Cousin Prudence's gowns. She wrote Lady Cavendish's correspondence. She rose early and slept late and learned, the way overlooked people always learn, to make herself small enough to be tolerated. And every single week, no matter how tired she was, she lit a stub of candle in her cold little room at the top of the house, and she wrote a letter to the one person in all the world who had ever truly seen her. His name was Nathaniel Hartley, and I need you to understand who he was to her, because it explains why she kept writing into 6 years of silence when any sensible woman would have stopped. It explains everything she was about to risk tonight. They had met as children. Nathaniel was the second son of a modest country family. No fortune, no title, no prospects beyond the army that second sons were always handed like a consolation. He had nothing the world valued, but he had noticed Eleanor. While the rest of Brookhaven looked straight through the quiet orphan girl, Nathaniel Hartley had sat with her by the river and asked her what she thought, about books, about the stars, about the lives they might one day lead. He listened to her answers as though they mattered, as though she mattered. "You see everything, Eleanor," he told her once, the summer before he left. "You notice what everyone else misses. One day the whole world is going to see what I already do." She was 19, he was 21, and on the night before he marched away to war, he took both her hands in his and made her a promise. "I will write to you," he said, "every chance I get. And when this war is over, I will come back, and I will have made something of myself, and I will ask you a question I am not nearly good enough to ask you yet." He smiled. "Wait for me. Will you wait for me, Eleanor?" "I would wait 100 years, she said. "Remember that promise. I will write to you every chance I get. Hold on to it, because within a year, the letters that came back from the war would stop completely. And what Eleanor would never know for 6 long years was that Nathaniel Hartley kept that promise in the only way the world left open to him. Just not the way she thought. For the first few months, his letters came, mud-stained, water-warped, full of longing and bad jokes and descriptions of stars over foreign fields. Eleanor read each one until it fell apart at the creases, and she answered every single one the same week. And then, in the autumn of the first year, the letters stopped. No warning, no final word. Just silence. She wrote to ask if he was ill. Silence. She wrote to the army. "Captain Hartley is listed as missing," came the cold reply. Presumed lost, not dead, presumed. And Eleanor, who noticed what everyone else missed, seized on that single word like a drowning woman seizing a rope. Missing was not dead. Missing meant somewhere, so she kept writing. The Cavendishes thought she had lost her mind. "He is gone, Eleanor," Lady Cavendish snapped, finding another sealed letter on the hall table. "It is unseemly. You are throwing your girlhood away on a dead man who never even had the decency to be somebody. Stop this foolishness and be grateful for the roof we have given you." But Eleanor did not stop. Week after week, month after month, year after year. 312 letters addressed to a man the whole world had buried, sent to an army post that simply absorbed them into silence. She had no way of knowing, no possible way. But every one of those letters was reaching him, every single one, and on the worst nights of his life. And there were nights so bad I can barely tell you about them. Those letters were the only thing keeping Nathaniel Hartley alive. Here is what had happened to him. Here is the thing Eleanor did not know. Nathaniel Hartley was not dead. He was not missing in the way the army meant. He was a prisoner. His unit had been ambushed and overrun, and Nathaniel, wounded, separated from the survivors, had been taken by the enemy. Not to an ordinary prison. He had the misfortune of being captured by men who realized slowly what they had. An English officer with connections, a potential source, a man who might be useful. So they kept him, in a stone cell, in a fortress far from any map an English soldier would recognize, for years. And his letters, the ones his captors intercepted from the army post they had compromised, became the cruelest weapon they had, because they read them. Of course they read them. And in those 300 letters from a woman named Eleanor Vance, they found the one thing every interrogator hunts for and rarely finds. They found what he loved. Now, I want you to understand the trap they built around him, because it is the whole heart of this story. They came to him one day, holding a stack of her letters, and they made him an offer that was really a threat, and the choice they forced him to make is the reason a good man let the woman he loved believe, for 6 years, that he had forgotten she existed. The commander of that fortress was a patient, clever, evil man, and he laid it out for Nathaniel very simply. "This woman," he said, fanning the letters like a winning hand of cards, "Eleanor, she writes to you faithfully, touching. Now, you are going to give me what I want, names, movements, the things an officer knows. And in exchange, I will let these letters keep reaching you, and I will let you write back to her. One letter, proof of life. Imagine her joy." Nathaniel said nothing. "Or," the commander continued, his voice gentle as a blade, "you refuse me, and I send my own man to England, I have many, to find this Eleanor Vance, and I make certain that the next thing she receives is not a letter at all." And in that cell, half-starved in chains, Nathaniel Hartley understood the math of his own heart. If he cooperated, if he betrayed his country to buy one letter home, men would die, and they would own him, and they would never, ever stop using her against him. But if they believed she meant nothing to him, if he showed no reaction, gave no sign, let her name pass his face like the name of a stranger, then she was worthless to them. A loose thread, not worth the cost of an assassin sent across a continent. The only way to protect Eleanor was to make her captors believe he did not care whether she lived or died. So that is what he did. He looked the commander in the eye, and with the last of his strength he laughed. "Write to her?" he said. "I don't even remember which one she is. Send your man if you like. It's nothing to me." It was the greatest lie he ever told. It was the bravest thing he ever did. And it cost him 6 years of silence, and it saved her life. And she never knew. He read every letter. Every week in secret, a sympathetic guard slipped them to him through the bars, and Nathaniel read them by moonlight and then destroyed them. So no one would ever see how he wept over them. 312 times, the woman he loved reached into that cell and gave him a reason to survive one more week. And 312 times, he could not send a single word back, because the cost of "I love you" was her life. So how did the soldier become a duke? While Nathaniel rotted in that cell, the world above him moved on. A fever swept through the Hartley family one bad winter. And when it was done, the old Duke of Ellesmere and his only son were both dead. The title, impossibly, fell to the next living male heir of the line, to a presumed dead captain in a foreign prison, to Nathaniel. But a dead man cannot inherit. And there was someone very much alive who was happy to step into the gap. Remember this name, because he is the villain of tonight. Sir Marcus Hartley. Nathaniel's cousin, the man who, with Nathaniel lost, became the new Duke of Ellesmere, the title, the lands, the fortune. All of it flowed to Marcus the moment Nathaniel was declared dead, and Marcus had every reason in the world to make very sure his cousin stayed dead. It took an exchange of prisoners, negotiated by a war that was finally, slowly ending, to bring Nathaniel home. Gaunt, hardened, years stolen from him, but alive. And when he set foot on English soil and learned the title was rightfully his, he reclaimed it. But here is what gnawed at him, even as he put on the Duke's silk and learned to answer to, "Your Grace." Two questions that would not let him sleep. The first, was Eleanor Vance still alive, still waiting, or had 6 years of silence finally killed the one good thing he had left? And the second, darker, colder. How had he stayed lost for so long? Prisoner exchanges had happened years earlier. His name should have been on a list. Someone should have come looking for a missing English officer with a claim to a dukedom. Someone had made very sure no one did. And Nathaniel, who had survived 6 years by paying attention to everything, had every intention of finding out who. But first before anything else in the world, he had to know if she was alive. And that is why a newly returned duke walked into a country ball he had no interest in attending, because he had heard, through a careful inquiry, that a poor relation named Eleanor Vance might be there. Which brings us back to where we began. The Cavendishes had brought Eleanor to the Hartwell ball, the way one brings a useful servant, to carry Prudence's shawl, to fetch and fade into the wallpaper. Eleanor had no gown of her own, worth the name. She stood at the edge of the candlelight in a made-over dress 3 seasons old, and she watched a world she was not really part of. And then she looked up, and the world stopped. Across the ballroom stood a man in a duke's dark silk, broader and harder than the boy she remembered, with gray threading the edges of his dark hair, though he was barely 30. But the eyes were the same. God help her, the eyes were exactly the same. Nathaniel. For a moment neither of them moved. The crowd, the music, the chandeliers, all of it fell away, and there were only 2 people who had been speaking to each other for 6 years across an impossible silence, finally in the same room. And then he was crossing the floor toward her, and the whispers were already starting. The Duke of Ellesmere? Why is he walking toward the Cavendish girl, the poor one? Surely not. And Eleanor could not breathe. He stopped before her. Up close she could see what the years had done. She could see the man who had survived something she could not yet imagine. "Eleanor," he said, just her name, his voice rough, and every bit of the heartbreak of 6 years rose up in her at once. 6 years, she whispered, 312 letters, and not one word back, not one. Her voice shook. "I mourned you, I defended you, I let them call me a fool for you, and you were alive. You were alive this whole time, and you never—" "Eleanor, did you even read them?" The question tore out of her. "Did you read a single one?" And the Duke of Ellesmere, the cold, hard, returned from the dead duke that half of England was already afraid of, looked at the woman in the made-over gown, and his composure cracked straight down the middle. "I read all of them," he said hoarsely. "Every word, 312 times. His jaw worked. "Eleanor, I have them memorized. I survived on them. And I could not write back. I could not. And if you let me, I will spend the rest of my life explaining why. But not here. Not where they can see your face. Not where they can see your face. Even now. Even home. Even free. Even a duke." The first instinct of this man was still to protect her from being watched. Eleanor didn't understand it yet, but she was about to. He drew her out onto a dark terrace, away from the eyes and the whispers. And there, in the cold night air, the Duke of Ellesmere told the poor relation everything. He told her about the ambush, the cell, the years. He told her about the commander and the letters fanned out like cards. And he told her about the lie, the terrible life-saving lie. I don't even remember which one she is. "They were looking for what I loved," he said, his voice breaking. "And I could not let it be you. The only way to keep you safe was to make them believe you were nothing to me. So I did. I let them believe it. I let you believe it. Every letter you sent, I read by moonlight and then burned, because if a single guard had seen my face while I read your words, they would have known. They would have sent a man for you. My silence was the only shield I had, and I held it for 6 years, and it nearly killed me, and I would do it again 1,000 times to keep you breathing. Eleanor stood in the dark, 6 years of grief and anger reshaping themselves in real time into something else entirely. You let me think you forgot me, she said slowly, to save my life. Yes. Every week you read a letter you could never answer? Yes. Nathaniel. Tears were running freely down her face now. That is the cruelest, most loving thing anyone has ever done for me. And for the first time in 6 years, Nathaniel Hartley reached out and took both her hands, exactly as he had the night before he marched away. And neither of them said anything at all, because some silences, finally, are full instead of empty. It should have been the end, the reunion, the truth, the two of them against all odds in a garden under the stars. But you and I both know it is not over, because there was still the question that wouldn't let Nathaniel sleep. Someone had kept him lost on purpose. Someone had wanted him to stay dead, and that someone was, at that very moment, walking out onto the terrace behind them. "Cousin Nathaniel," came a smooth, cold voice. "How touching." Sir Marcus Hartley stepped into the moonlight, elegant, controlled, and watching the two of them with the eyes of a man calculating a loss. Because Marcus had a great deal to lose. With Nathaniel returned, the dukedom, the title, the lands, every penny Marcus had spent 6 years enjoying, reverted to its rightful owner. Marcus had gone, overnight, from duke to dependent. And Nathaniel, who had survived 6 years by paying attention, looked at his cousin's face and finally understood the second mystery. "It was you," Nathaniel said quietly. "The prisoner exchanges. My name should have come home years ago. You had the connections, you had the influence, you knew I was alive, and you made certain no one came for me. You left me in that cell to keep my title." Marcus did not even bother to deny it. He simply smiled. "You were dead, Nathaniel," he said. "Officially, conveniently. And do you know, I rather think you should have stayed that way." His gaze slid to Eleanor, and his smile sharpened. "And now, here you are, about to attach yourself to a penniless nobody and parade your sad little war story for all of society. It would be such a shame if questions were raised about your fitness. 6 years in an enemy's cell. Who knows what a man agrees to in a place like that? Who knows where his loyalties truly lie? A whisper in the right ears, cousin, and the great returned hero becomes a suspected traitor, and I become the Duke again. And there it is, the trap closing. Marcus held real power, the power of a rumor. A returned prisoner is desperately easy to smear. One whispered suggestion that Nathaniel had broken under captivity, had turned, had sold secrets, and his reputation, his title, even his freedom could be destroyed. Marcus had kept him in a cell for 6 years. Now he was prepared to put him in a far worse one, and the only person standing between Nathaniel and ruin was the one everyone had spent their whole lives overlooking. Marcus expected Nathaniel to threaten him, to rage. That was the kind of move Marcus knew how to counter. He never saw Eleanor coming. No one ever did. That was always her advantage. She had spent 6 years as a poor relation, fetching, mending, writing other people's correspondence, fading into the wallpaper of grand houses. And people who fade into the wallpaper hear things. They are trusted with things. They are in the room when important men forget they are present. Names, movements, the things an officer knows, Eleanor said softly, repeating the words Nathaniel had used about his captors. Then she turned to Marcus. "You want to talk about loyalties, Sir Marcus? Let us talk about correspondence. I write letters for a living. I have written them in half the great houses of this county. And it is remarkable what passes across a writing desk when everyone assumes the girl holding the pen is too unimportant to understand it." Marcus's smile flickered. "I have spent 6 years," Eleanor went on, her voice steady and clear, "in rooms where men like you do business, and I remember everything. I notice what everyone else misses. Nathaniel always said so. So, before you whisper one word about his loyalty, you should ask yourself how much I have quietly learned about yours. About the letters you intercepted, about the army contact you paid to keep a certain officer missing, about exactly how a man comes to abandon his own blood in an enemy prison to steal a title. She tilted her head. I have it written down, Sir Marcus. Of course I do. I write everything down. Now, was that all true? Did Eleanor really have proof of everything she'd just claimed? Here's the beautiful part. It didn't matter. Because Marcus had done every one of those things, and a guilty man cannot tell the difference between a woman who knows everything and a woman who is brave enough to pretend she does. She took his own weapon, the whisper, the rumor, the threat of exposure, and she turned it around and pressed it to his throat. The blood drained from Marcus Hartley's face, because he had done all of it. And he could not know how much this quiet, overlooked woman had truly seen. And a man with that many true crimes cannot risk a single one of them being spoken aloud. You wouldn't dare, he breathed. I waited 6 years for a dead man, Eleanor said. Try me. Marcus Hartley folded like wet paper. By the next morning, Nathaniel's solicitors, armed with Eleanor's careful, devastating memory, and the documents her testimony pointed them toward, had everything they needed: the intercepted correspondence, the bribed army clerk, the paper trail of a man who had left his own cousin to die for a title. Marcus was given the same kind of choice he had once forced on others: leave England forever and surrender every claim, or stand trial for what amounted to treason against his own blood. He chose exile. He sailed within the month, stripped of everything, and England never spoke his name again. And the sympathetic guard, the man who had slipped Eleanor's letters through the bars of that cell for 6 years, at the risk of his own life, Nathaniel found him, tracked him down, brought him to England, and saw him housed and paid and safe for the rest of his days. Because Nathaniel Hartley never forgot a debt, and he most certainly never forgot the man who had carried Eleanor's words to him in the dark. And as for the question that started it all, the 312 letters and the answer 6 years overdue, Nathaniel had not forgotten that either. A week after the ball, a letter arrived for Eleanor Vance at Brookhaven, the first letter she had received from Nathaniel Hartley in 6 years. Her hands shook so badly she could barely break the seal. Lady Cavendish hovered, suddenly very interested now that the penniless soldier had turned out to be a duke. Eleanor ignored her completely and walked up to her cold little room at the top of the house and sat on her narrow bed and opened it. It was short. After 6 years, it was only a few lines. It read, Eleanor, I owe you 312 replies. I intend to deliver every one of them in person over the rest of our lives, if you will allow it. I made you a promise by a river once, that I would come home, make something of myself, and ask you a question I was not good enough to ask. I am still not good enough, but I am home, and I am done being silent. Will you wait for me, just a little longer, while I come to ask it properly? N. She did not have to wait long. He was at the door of Brookhaven within the hour, in the rain, hat in hand, looking up at the window of the cold little room where a poor relation had written into the dark for 6 years and never once given up. And this time, when Nathaniel Hartley took both her hands in his, he asked her the question, the right way. On one knee, in front of the astonished Cavendishes, in front of everyone who had ever looked straight through her, and Eleanor Vance, who had waited 100 years in the space of 6, gave him the answer she had been holding for all of them. 1 year later, the Duchess of Ellesmere sat at a writing desk in a warm, bright room, her own room now, in her own home, with no one in the world able to call her a poor relation ever again. She was writing a letter. She still wrote one every week, but now they traveled no further than across the house, to a husband who answered every single one before the ink was dry, sometimes in person, sometimes with a note slipped under a door. Always answered. 312 unanswered letters. And then, a lifetime of replies. Nathaniel came and stood behind her, resting his hands on her shoulders, reading over her shoulder, the way he had once read by moonlight in a place neither of them ever spoke of anymore. What are you writing? He asked. A letter, she said, to a soldier I once knew, who taught a girl nobody noticed that she was worth crossing 6 years of silence for. He turned her chair gently to face him. He was the lucky one, Nathaniel said. He just took an unforgivably long time to say so. And that guard, the one who slipped the letters through the bars, he stood up at their wedding as an honored guest. Because the people who do quiet, dangerous kindnesses in the dark, expecting nothing, those are the people who change everything. But that is a truth for the very end of our story. So, here's what I want you to carry with you tonight. The whole world looked at Eleanor Vance and saw nothing worth seeing. A poor relation. A foolish girl writing letters to a dead man. Someone to overlook, to pity, to use. The whole world was wrong. Because the quiet ones, the ones writing into the dark, the ones nobody answers, the ones who keep their promises when there is no reward and no audience and no proof anyone is even listening, they are so often the strongest people in the room. Eleanor's faith looked like foolishness for 6 years, and then, in a single night, it turned out to be the bravest thing anyone in that ballroom had ever done. And Nathaniel's silence looked like cruelty, like forgetting, like the worst kind of abandonment. And it was, in truth, the deepest love a person can offer. The love that protects you even at the cost of your own good name, even when you will never get the credit, even when the one you're protecting will spend years believing you betrayed them. So, do not be so quick to read the silence as not caring. Do not be so quick to decide the quiet ones are weak, or that the people who didn't answer simply didn't love you. Sometimes the loudest love there is the kind that holds its tongue to keep you safe. And whatever you are writing into the dark right now, whatever letter, whatever hope, whatever faith no one seems to be answering, understand this. You never truly know who is reading by moonlight on the other side. Keep writing. If Eleanor and Nathaniel's story moved you tonight, do something for me. Tell me in the comments. Would you have kept writing after 6 years of silence? And which moment got you? The truth on the terrace or the letter at the end? I read every single one. And if you believe the quiet, faithful ones deserve their happy ending, subscribe and turn on the bell, so the next story finds its way to you. Your next one is already waiting.